Greetings. TIDES has been an effort over the last several years focusing on ensuring that we use new approaches to data and technology to better respond to disasters in a human and people-centered manner that uplifts communities. That said, our world is now facing interesting challenges. The rate at which technologies are changing and new data approaches are changing are challenging how societies and communities can keep up with this change. At the same time, we're seeing increased stresses and turbulences, whether it be in the area of responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's responding to global food challenges, whether it's responding to supply chain disruptions. We're seeing more and more cases of displaced individuals, displaced communities, and more cases in which disasters are occurring, as well as social upheaval that raises questions about how we can use data and technology to ensure both people as individuals, but more importantly, people as communities are more resilient to those changes. It's been talked about by the idea from Tom Friedman and others that we need to have what's called complex adaptive coalitions. Or as Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Sue Gordon has once said, how do we do things that involve shared goals, shared outcomes, distributed responsibilities and execution. These are challenges that we're going to be facing, and we're going to join a very robust panel today in which we hear from Krista Pawley, Dr. Joe Bonivel, Dr. Eric Rasmussen, and Dr. Jahn as we look at these challenges, and we join that panel already in progress. I'm Dr. David Bray, inaugural director of the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center, and I look forward to this discussion already in progress as we think about how the world can move forward and how TIDES can play an instrumental part in that world ahead.
And I work on a global level in spaces around catalytic governance and digital identity as key areas of focus. So I'm not going to say that those are the two most important things, but they're the things that I'm working on that I think can really help to impact the work that TIDES is doing. I'd start with probably the governance space. And I think as we look around the world, recognizing that there needs to be a new model of governance if we're going to build resilient societies and economies. And yes, that's less in the disaster space. That is not, disaster time is not the time to start looking at governance structures, but I would argue that we need to take the time to look at these governance structures and to redesign them to ensure that when disasters do happen, that we have the right infrastructure set up to support. And what I've been working on and what I would suggest is that there needs to be a transformation of governance. And I loved what Friedman said around trust is the only legal performance enhancing drug. And I think that is the foundation of what we need in our governance structures. And so if we look at reimagining governance and get rid of the hierarchical top-down methodology and start with dialogue as opposed to debate. Let's look and see what we've got in common, where we can hear each other's voices and what we can build from, and start to build communities of practice where we start to recognize the humanity and the common will in each other and move forward from that point rather than defining ourselves by our differences. And that sounds very Pollyanna, but I'll say, like, I've been working with some great leaders around the world on these different models of governance and really putting it into practice on some really tough questions. And the beauty is it does work. We have models to get there. It doesn't have to be the acrimonious models that we're seeing today. And where that can ultimately lead us, I think, is a really positive place for societies around the world. If I then take that into a practical application of something we're working on here in Canada that's been designed through this model of governance, I would look at the digital identity space. So in Canada, 3 weeks ago, we launched version 1.0 of what we call the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. The trust framework has been co-created with multiple levels of government, multiple private sector partners. It's been done in the open. It's been done with a principle of interoperability and privacy by design. We have over 20 organizations that are already using this. In fact, today, Ontario, our largest province, has just announced that we're looking to move all digital identity about me into a digital environment and digital wallets, and doing that in an inclusive way to protect people's identity and enable them to access the services that they need. What does that mean in disaster relief? It means that if I'm in a displaced persons camp, I can prove who I am, where I went to school, what property I have, what my medical condition is, and I can get out of that camp faster. It means when I'm trying to move across borders, I have access to all that is my data and data about me, regardless of my nationhood. And that means I can get settled faster. I can gain access to services faster. Like, those are tangible things that this sometimes unsexy tool can provide. And I find that's a great example of what an inclusive trust-based governance model could deliver. And it's where I see great hope and opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you, Krista. And I think you hit the nail on the head saying that let's think about how we can actually work together, govern, coexist, and how we can use technologies to help those who have been displaced or those who are less fortunate. So, and do so before the disaster happens, because we do not want to put that in place as we're trying to figure out to respond to it itself. Now I would like to turn to Dr. Joe Bonivel. Joe, real quick, could you introduce yourself briefly? And similarly, your thoughts about where could actually StarTIDES help lead the way to creating a world that's more resistant to shocks and disruptions and to turbulence ahead?
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. Well, it's good afternoon now. Joseph Bonivel. I'm also a non-resident fellow at the Geotech Center, mechanical engineer by background. But to just dive right into it, I think Krista hit the nail on the head. I think her governance formula really works well for me, and what I consider is open data, right? I think that in order for us in STARS to really kind of move forward in this new world that we're building, we've got to trust the data that we've got, and it's got to be open data, right? And so I believe that given that open data that any person can see and know where their data is going and know that they can trust that the data is being used for the correct reasons, allows us to move forward as a society and to help build a resilient society. Kind of moving forward in that same vein, she brought up really something that I used to work on when I did the Ebola pandemic back at USAID a few years back. Interoperability of health information systems, right? And so the ability to be able to verify who you are and be able to move you across borders at times when there's a pandemic or any type of emergency going on. That was something that we tried to implement, and one of the things that we learned is converging research is very important. Making sure that all of these individual silos have a marker at the top that says, listen, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's collaborate so that we can fulfill whatever goal this is. You see it all the time in military. I work with the DoD, but we see that all the time in the military. We don't necessarily see it when it comes to disaster efforts and responses. How do we move these things in the same path at the same time with each individual mandate being successfully implemented?
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. And I think you also underscored a very key point, which is if we need to move forward, we need to have both openness, transparency, and interoperability to data and information. Without that, then in some respects, we're operating blind. And that's some of the things we need to think about as we move forward. Would now like to turn to on the phone, we have Dr. Molly Jahn. Molly, I know you've done a lot of work when it comes to thinking about food security and food stability. I was wondering if maybe you could sort of share your insights in this space about what could StarTIDES do to create a world that's more resistant to shocks and disruptions as well.
Sure, and greetings, everyone. I'm a scientist by training, but have become interested after some government service in some of the really monstrous scale vulnerabilities that were evident to me, disaster or no disaster, that can be either exploited or can add up to some extremely perverse event amplifying dynamics. And we saw that in spades in COVID in the food system, where we suffered a shock, but that shock was exacerbated many times over in terms of severity by the rigidity and brittleness of our distribution systems. Those distribution systems were built for a very different purpose from resilience. They were built for efficiency in a very low margin industry, which also is not, it tends to have fairly low levels of compliance, even with the required paperwork and insurance. And so when COVID hit, we undertook an effort, collaborative effort, that leveraged a capability that was already embedded widely in U.S. food system for compliance management and repurposed it because transparency is very empowering to all, and we know that even in disasters we see misuse of that capability. And so what we created was an accredited marketplace where those with stranded product could find food assistance and essentially, make a frictionless supply chain where if there was a break in the network, that link could quickly reform. But among entities that had been vetted in terms of their entrance into the marketplace, we saw many things happening post March, April, May in the food system that were very concerning: outright theft, misrepresentation of identity, etc. So I think that StarTides can provide, and I understand Tom Friedman emphasized trusted networks that can create line of sight so that we can better both perceive and transmit small but consequential signals with the goal to mitigate or damp down those signals, as opposed to the way many of our structures are today, which fail to detect and hence amplify, often in multiple dimensions, greatly exaggerating the damage and risk. And if you want to see what that looks like, foodsourceusa.com is the site we built. That's that sort of eBay for people with stranded food looking for food banks.
Excellent. Well said, Molly. And I think the two very key points that you underscored is, first, recognize that the current system that we have oftentimes exacerbates issues and does not respond adaptively to it. And then two, like you said, thinking about that really it's about how do you do sense making of what might be low-level signals, but they're signals that can encourage you to have more trust and respond more adaptively as opposed to exacerbating the issue. So very key points. Would now like to finally turn to our final panelist, Dr. Eric Rasmussen. Eric, real quick, if you could introduce yourself. You have obviously seen a lot, both in your INSTED and DoD background in terms of a lot of disasters. And I guess I would ask, given those experiences of what you've seen in terms of responses in the past, what should we be mindful as we go to the future? And are there new trends that we should be aware of as well, where StarTides can play a role as well for the coming challenges ahead?
Absolutely. Yes, I think so. So, yes, I'm a physician, you're right, and a lot of years in the Navy, a few years at DARPA, a few years since then, doing other things. But one of the things that we do is work with data and work with mapping, and where we have just heard a very strong argument for trust. It started with our keynote earlier today. It was echoed here on this panel. And identity, digital identity turns out to be a critical component of those, particularly who are invisible, are most vulnerable, at risk of being enslaved, are displaced, and interoperability, as Joseph mentioned. That interoperability turns out to be one of the key components of success in a recently challenged environment, whether it's a natural disaster, a post-conflict environment, or anything else. And what Molly has had to say about what we know about integrating logistics systems that have to be repurposed because what we had in place was not adequate to the task, I think is a critical understanding of something that Tom Friedman mentioned in his keynote, and that is the formation of complex adaptive coalitions. The idea that right now, down at the neighborhood level, down at the community level, we have the ability to put together those resources that we need because we are all willing to work with one another. That trust component is possible when it's down inside Dunbar's number, when we're down inside some place where we can all understand who we are, what we've gone through together, and how we can shape the future that we all want to build. As we begin to build that higher and higher and higher in governmental structures, it becomes less and less possible to track who we trust and to understand agendas, and being able to bring in data and mapping around the information that we need to accrue is something that, for one example, is done by a completely free coalition of the willing called the Worldwide Human Geography Data Working Group. That's thousands of people in multiple countries who have chosen to exchange free and open data around human security. And sometimes it is around natural disasters, sometimes around population migration, environmental degradation, climate change. All of that data can be collected, can be shared, can turn into mapping and visualization that helps a greater degree of understanding. www.tide.org is a free system, a bunch of people that come together just to share data. And with data that is trustable, that is freely shared, that can be visualized, you can gain a little bit of trust. You can gain some of the identity you require. You can repurpose your logistics, and you can ensure things, because they're open, are interoperable. What do you think?
Very well said, Eric, and that's a lot to unpack there. And I think, in particular, pointing towards the example of how you already have an existing community that does make geography and understanding geography and maps about geography available. This may be a pointing towards a sign of these complex adaptive coalitions, in this case, not defined by proximity, but in terms of shared interests, because it does raise an interesting question. I'm going to go first to Eric and then to Krista on this question, which is, if the future are these complex adaptive coalitions, I've also heard former Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Sue Gordon, talk about what she calls shared goals, shared outcomes, distributed execution. And that's often the hard time. But if this is the world we're going into, how do we make sure that these remain inclusive and diverse? I mean, what if everyone says, I'm only going to hang out with people that are like me? And how do we make sure that doesn't happen? So Eric, I'd go to your first thoughts on this, and then Krista on these challenges ahead.
It's an interesting question, and I've listened to a number of viewpoints on that recently that I want to share for just a moment. I was one of the physicians at Standing Rock a couple of years ago, watching people come together from around the nation to a common purpose. We also have recently seen a lot of protests in recognition of some structural issues inside US society that are causing disruptions that can then be manipulated both for good and for ill. And I wound up one of the physicians at CHAZ here in Seattle, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, and being on the ground and watching the diversity of that response, watching, frankly, the peacefulness of that response. It was violent at the beginning, it was violent at the end, but the point that they were trying to make at the time was what kind of societal changes need to take place before trust, before equity can be established. It was the same message at Standing Rock with a different community a few years earlier. That kind of understanding of what's needed is actually percolating through human society, particularly inside the United States at a fairly low level, but it's a great deal more visible than it used to be. And so I think that once we begin to gain that capacity for trust, that building coalition, we're going to have tools that are stronger than they used to be to hold to that and not be so easily disrupted, so easily manipulated, so easily lied about. And that's going to be an important way to move forward.
Well said, Eric. Krista, I'll turn to you, and recognizing you've done a lot of space in both thinking about electronic governance, identity measures. If we want to make sure that these aren't just coalitions defined by people that look or think exactly the way we do, how do you recommend that these complex adaptive coalitions are more inclusive and diverse in their actions and activities? Oh, and you're muted, sorry.
Apologies. I'm going to build, and very well said, Eric. I'd build off of that because it is about building. The reality is that you're not going to solve this with a broad brushstroke across across sectors, but it's going to be about building that trust. And I would suggest that it needs to be not about looking at inclusion in existing frameworks, but it actually means going back to the drawing board and reimagining whole systems. And it's going to be hard work. But trying to wedge inclusion into existing models is not going to actually create the inclusion. We need to be inclusive by design. We need to, and it's one of the exciting things. So I'm not the pessimist on this. I actually see huge opportunity in the fact that we're building so many different systems, that we're reimagining resilience in light of what we're going through right now. So as we do that, my call to this community and to anybody I speak to is, as you're reimagining these systems, truly reimagine them. Don't go back to what you know works, but start from the beginning and say, okay, who do we need to bring to the table, and actively seek them out and make sure that they're brought in and make sure that they are creating the design of the frameworks, not just being put on as we need this kind of proportion at the table. When you do that, when we get into truly inclusive data design, when we start to look at different models of how to do things. I'm going to give a concrete example. I was speaking with a young woman yesterday who's working in Africa, but she's actually doing a project here in Canada, and she's working with women's shelters and trying to create safe spaces in a digital environment while many women are at risk and locked in with potentially abusive partners. There is no way, with all respect to my wonderful white male colleagues, that a white man was coming up with that challenge and that need and was going to create a solution for that. That only comes up when you have different voices at the table. And so if we're going to understand the problems, we need to have different voices and different faces at the table, and we need to be active and aggressive in making sure that we bring those voices to the table.
Very well said. And I particularly like how you underscored that let's not spend time trying to perfect 19th century thinking, that we need to actually think anew for the 21st century and learn from that and go forward and make sure it is inclusive by design. So very well said, Krista.
David,
yes, go ahead, Molly.
Can I hop in quickly?
Sure.
It's Molly. I just wanted to say that a strategy in our work that has been extremely meaningful to me is we have sought out ordinary institutions in communities that serve populations that have been historically either under-supported or in one way or another marginalized. For example, high schools. Most communities have a high school where it's known that that may face more challenges than the other high schools. In both the big cities in our state, we have high schools in that category. They are both centers of lots of major problems, but also just getting to school in the morning for many of those students is solving a really hard problem. And I have great optimism along the lines of Krista for what it might mean to unlock the talent that lives in places that are often overlooked for solving hard problems, especially if we don't force that talent through 7th grade or 9th grade algebra or 7th grade grammar, where because the traditional academic deficits are in the schools I work in profound by 9th grade, but the talent is breathtaking. And also communities of faith can be very vibrant, effective loci for not just bringing approaches, but just really creating new, that co-creation that happens when different ideas come together. These are relationships that take time, sustained time, long periods of time and persistence and patience and generosity. But for me, these have been the most important. This has been the most important work I've done in my career.
Well said, and I really liked how you highlighted that, one, it's important work, it's hard work, and there may be lessons that we can learn. Public health long learned that it's not enough to have a worthy cause or mission, that you actually need to address both how do you engage the community and existing community structures and leaders, and then also how do you engage the education side. So very well said, Molly. I'm going to turn now to Joe. We had actually a question from Doug, and I will say, please feel free, audience members, to type your questions in the chat, and we'll raise them here. Doug points out that trying to do coalition building using data is difficult before and during a crisis. I thought maybe, Joe, if you could real quick briefly share possible strategies, like how do we do this virtually? I mean, recognizing video is definitely suboptimal. Right. How do we do the equivalent of breaking bread with people that we may never actually get to meet in person to build a coalition?
So I actually think Doug's hit the nail on the head. I think I'm going to kick back to a comment that Krista said, and it's inclusion by design, right? So what we want to make sure we do as at the onset of any natural disaster emergency, you want to make sure who are we missing? Who is not at the table when we're trying to solve this particular problem, right? That's something that I think the DoD does very well. No man left behind kind of mentality, but who is not at the table and who are we missing in trying to come up with this solution, right? And so as I start to look at some of the teams that are working here at STARS with this, looking at the Puerto Rico and rural connectivity, right? Bringing the internet online, or bringing the internet to the rural communities, rather. I start to think about, well, who are you missing in that conversation, right? That doesn't answer. I'm going to come back to your question, David, but I wanted to make sure I pointed this out, because I think for me it's very important that and David's heard me say this many times. We need to understand the digital divide, and we need to make sure we try to bridge that digital divide. Right. Because I think right now we are right at the edge of leaving a lot of people behind. We have a lot of early adopters. As Molly mentioned, you've got your faith-based communities that can help bring those early adopters, help the middle-aged adopters, if you're talking about a bell curve, move forward. But we want to make sure we don't leave that last third of the bell curve behind. Now, back to back to Doug's point. It's not easy. What I have seen is that there's two things that you need to make sure. You have to understand and trust the data, as we've continued to harp on here. And you need to make sure that the sense making behind the data is true, right? So we can have any of the data that we want, but we can make it tell any story that we want to tell, right? And so I think that in this age of misinformation, you need to make sure that you're telling a true story that will make sense and goes all the way back down to the end user, right? So at the end of the day, we're trying to solve a problem. We're trying to create a response. And is it actually helping the person on the ground? Is it actually helping the person that needs help? And if you don't have that data in this virtual world, you've got to find it. And that is a question that I'll pose back out to all of my panel members, because I don't have the answer to it. I have a couple of thoughts about it, but really understanding that what I call in software world our end user and what they need, and defining their metrics is kind of what can kick you back up from a grassroots organization all the way up to kind of solving the problem that you're looking at.
Well said. All right, so I'm going to go to two remaining questions, recognizing we've got about 7 minutes left. I'm going to go first to Eric and Molly. Eric, I know you've done a lot when it comes to tackling misinformation, disinformation, and this gets to a little bit of Joe saying that, that this is challenging. We're in a world in which we're seeing not just in the United States, we're seeing in Europe, we're even seeing in Canada, which usually is seen as the place in which there isn't the polarization, but we even see it starting to show up there as well. How do we develop trust even if we don't have shared truth? I think we can actually do it, but I think we need to recognize that this is a challenge we have, that if we spend time trying to fight over truth, we may never get to the level where we say we can still trust each other with differences. And then also, if we're in a world with that, Eric and then Molly, it's not just about humans anymore. I mean, 2013 was the year that there was more bot traffic on the internet than there were humans. We're now at about 45 to 50 billion network devices relative to only 7.7 billion people. So 6 to 7 times as many network devices on the planet. The future disaster response is not just human to human, it's human to machine and machine to machine. So Eric, recognizing we have a very short moment of time, what would you think about how do we tackle misinformation, disinformation, but also this new digital reality that has a lot of machines?
Data helps. And Krista is a Canadian, and one of the most beautiful examples of how misinformation is being propagated came out of the study of the information flowing around the Trudeau election a year ago. That is a map that came out of CMU that showed that a very large fraction of those sharing information, echoing information, were bots. The fact that we have now algorithms that can begin to identify the behavior with very high specificity and sensitivity of when you do not have a human behind. Now, whether the humans are being used to propagate messages that are also misinformation, disinformation is a slightly different question, but don't lose track of the fact that the algorithms are getting better and better and better at recognizing those behaviors that are probably not coming from a human, so should be either discounted or at the very least recognized. And I would start with data. I agree with you. When you cannot agree on a common set of facts, trust is very difficult to establish. The first thing you need to understand is who you're talking to, whose opinion you're listening to. I'll stop there for now.
Very well said, Eric. I'll ask, have you seen examples of where misinformation, disinformation can cause disruptive effects on the food supply? I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I have seen it most notably, actually, not so much in food, but in spoofed crowdsourced wildfire reports. And so, as in thinking about your question, and the very short period of time we have, I would say pre-positioning trust relationships. And we've shown this time and time again in major disasters. Wisconsin prides itself on being first to many of the big hurricanes because of the long tradition in this part of the country with cooperatives. So the electric utility knows the propane guys, knows the linemen, et cetera. So, and they can move very, very fast. So I think pre-positioning those trusted relationships so that in a crisis, we can take that leap, whatever it is that our larger, more complex compound disasters throw us. We can make those decisions together and move quickly ground up. So I think that pre-positioning, those links between people is really important, and leveraging where we've done that already in even quite traditional structures like co-ops.
Excellent. And like you said, recognizing the human element is so important. And while we obviously would prefer to have trust in place before the disaster, we may also need to figure out ways that maybe I've never met you before, Molly, but we both know Eric, and Eric can help connect us in the middle of the crisis. All right, I'm going to go now to Joe and to Krista for the closing. We've got about 3 minutes, and here's a big one. So we've talked about doing these complex adaptive coalitions, which might actually challenge the existing institutions and governance structures that are present. There are some that say any attempted coup is only successful if the existing power base allows it to happen. So if we are going to be running against existing governance structures that are used to operating more top-down, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Joe, and then Krista, as to how do we work this, recognizing that there may be nation states that say, get back in your box. What are you trying to do? I don't understand this. How do you make it so that it's acceptable to have these complex adaptive coalitions in the midst of existing governance structures?
So I think connectivity. I think connectivity is the answer. I think, you have places around the world, and it's not to be disparaging about anywhere around the world, that don't allow you to get onto the internet. They don't allow you to necessarily propagate news. But I think that places like China, they've been able to come up with ways that news is propagated, and they've been able to come up with, for lack of a better word, secret lines of communication where they're, because they're connected to the internet and because they're connected to their version of Twitter, they can produce mass amounts of information that then allows them to build a coalition of trusted people that within their individual sect to make change. I think that you've got to figure out a way to connect people, particularly in this COVID-19 world, where they can trust those that are around them, as we've said before, but allow them to be a force for good. That's what I should say, technology for good. So the connectivity allows you to be technology for good and to move forward. I don't want to take all my time up, so
Excellent. Well, that was great, Joe, and I really appreciate it. You say, connectivity, and that gets to, again, if we talk about being inclusive, we may need to actually look on efforts to make sure everyone has the ability to get connected, because there are still some people that don't have that option. So that's very key. So Krista, it sounds like to wrap it and bring it home for us, we're talking about how do you build shared culture with people that you may never have met before, with machines you may never have met before, and do so across geography. What's your closing recommendations for how do we work to build shared culture?
I think it's building on what everybody else has said. So it's two things. One is moving from this debate to dialogue. Stop looking for where we're different and start looking for where we have common interests and common values, and build from that. That's the point of strength. That's what we're actually going to be able to move forward on. So that dialogue focus is going to be critical. And I think as both actually everybody has touched on, is this concept of trust by proxy. Is I may not have the opportunity to know you. And I think of the fact Molly and I have been doing work together. We've never met in person, but I feel close to her over the past number of months because we've been able to get this trust by proxy through other relationships. I think we're going to see more of that. And so I would encourage those of us who do have robust networks, who have built up that trust in a pre-COVID environment, to bring that and make that part of your offering to the work that we're trying to do, is leverage those networks and expand that trust by proxy, because I do think that's going to be transformative in building these complex coalitions when we don't have the ability to meet in person. But I think we've got the power.
We've got the power, and very well said. And I want to give closing thanks to Krista, Joe, Eric, and Molly. What I know some of you hinted at, but what the audience may not know is you are all also with the Atlantic Council as fellows. Lynn Wells, of course, our host for the events today, is also a fellow with the Atlantic Council as well. We raise that because we hope, working together with StarTIDES, we can begin to build this coalition, these complex adaptive coalitions across geographies, across interest areas. Again, thank you very much, Krista, Joe, Eric, and Molly, for all that you do as positive change agents. Thank you for the audience for joining. And thank you again, Lynn Wells and StarTIDES, for all that you do.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.